Maybe for you, it's the way that you hold your breath when you hear your spouse's keys in the lock, not because you're afraid of them, but because maybe you feel this immediate heavy pressure to set the tone for the evening so that they stay in a good mood. Or maybe it's that text from your best friend that you haven't replied to yet. You aren't just busy, but maybe you're paralyzed because you feel a sense of responsibility for her loneliness. And you are convinced that if you don't say the perfect, comforting thing, then you are failing her. Or, and this one that hits closest to home for many of us, it's the way that you watch your children. So when they're struggling or angry or maybe just having a bad day, you feel it as a personal indictment of your worth as a mother. You feel like their discomfort is a fire that you are legally required to put out. And if you don't do that, then you haven't done your job. And maybe even further than that, you have failed as a mother. And this is what I call the unspoken contract. And with the unspoken contract, we tell ourselves, if they are okay, then I am allowed to be okay. But that is so heavy and becomes an impossible way to live. And even more than that, it is a survival strategy that is born out of attachment wounds, where we learned in our formative years that being the fixer was the only way to be the safe one. And so today, we are going to untangle the knot of what I'm calling false responsibility and talk about what it actually looks like to let your loved ones own their own emotions so that you can finally own yours. So let's get into it.
Welcome to Reclaiming Me, a trauma-informed podcast helping women with complex PTSD heal the lasting impact of childhood attachment wounds from parents and caregivers, so you can finally release people-pleasing and perfectionism and learn to trust in relationships, beginning with the one you have with yourself. I'm your host, Cindy Payne, therapist, trauma specialist, and a woman who has walked this path both personally and professionally.
Welcome back, everybody, to another full-length episode of Reclaiming Me. And I'm so glad that you have joined us today. And before we dive into what I'm calling my minivan story and the ghosts of our history, I want to give you 3 pillars to hold on to during this episode today. So if you take nothing else away, please let it be these 3 things. And the first one is that responsibility is actually not a feeling or emotion. So just because you feel the weight of someone else's mood doesn't mean that weight actually belongs to you. And number 2, survival is not a flaw. I've said this here many times, and I'm going to continue to say that again, that the ways in which you learned to monitor other people's feelings were brilliant adaptations to an unpredictable world. And it is not a personality defect on your part. And finally, space is the ultimate goal, not perfection. So healing isn't about stopping the urge to fix it instantly, but it is about creating maybe a 3 to 5 second pause between the feeling that's coming up inside of you and the action. So when we talk about these moments of relational pressure, what we are talking about again is something that I am calling false responsibility. And in plain language, false responsibility really just means this deep subconscious belief that you are the cause of and therefore the solution to other people's internal states. This is the invisible management tier of your life. And it happens when your brain starts to treat someone else's internal weather as your job description. And right alongside this is something that we call unearned guilt. And unearned guilt is that gnawing feeling that you've done something wrong simply because someone else is unhappy. And for women, especially with CPTSD, guilt isn't just a feeling. Guilt is more of a default setting. So you feel bad, not because you've crossed a boundary necessarily, but because you aren't doing, quote, enough to keep everyone else good in your life. So, why does this matter so much in the context of complex post-traumatic stress disorder? Well, because for us, this again wasn't just feminine intuition or being the nurturer. This isn't about your mindset. This is more about survival wiring. So you have learned to manage the mood of the room so the room wouldn't crush you. And this is not about being sensitive. This is more about being a strategist. So recently, I have really been trying to get back into reading more because I discovered that when I am in high states of uncertainty, stress, anxiety, reading really helps me to connect with another person's story, and it just helps overall with downshifting my nervous system, especially at the end of the day after I have processed a lot of emotion. And I recently finished a book called The Mad Wife by Megan Church. And if you haven't read this book or heard of this book before, it is a haunting reminder that this is also a cultural hand-me-down. And this book is set in the 1950s when women were expected to be these emotional shock absorbers for the entire family. So what that might have looked like in that time period is, keeping this perfect facade. And if they were unable to keep the facade up, then they were often labeled hysterical. And that was an actual diagnosis that the doctor would give to the woman if she was displaying, let's say, symptoms of, anxiety, maybe postpartum depression, etc. And so we have inherited this collective wiring as women, even today in 2026, that says if the people around me aren't happy, then I must be failing at my job as a mother, a wife, a friend, a caregiver, a coworker, etc. And so today I'd like to unpack exactly where that fixer wiring comes from. And we're going to look at how it shows up in your second shift at home with your spouse if you're married, and your kids if you're a parent. And most importantly, we are going to learn how to distinguish between what is actually yours to carry and what is simply unearned guilt that you are finally allowed to put down. And just a short caveat, if you are not married and you are not a mom, this episode is still for you because just by the nature of being a woman in our culture in today's time, you have probably also experienced some of this unearned guilt. So, where does this fixer wiring actually start? And in order to answer that question, we have to go back to the origin story. And I'll be honest with you, this hits so close to home for me. because in my family of origin, the standard of care was incredibly complicated. As I've shared on here before, my grandmother actually raised my sister and myself because my mother was struggling with mental illness and did not have the capacity to be our primary caregiver. And not only was my grandmother raising us, but she was also the emotional container for my mother, which just simply meant holding her together while also trying to hold us together. But there is a famous concept in psychology, and it's called the ghosts in the nursery. And what this concept is something that suggests that when a caregiver has an unspoken or unmourned tragedy, like the loss of a child, that grief becomes a silent ghost in the room. And not only was my grandmother mourning the loss of my mother, even though she was still very much alive, she was also mourning her other daughter who had passed a year before I was born. So this was my mother's younger sister. And it was a freak accident, which involved alcohol and just a bunch of college kids celebrating the end of a semester. And from what I learned of the story, it was more of a cautionary tale, of what could happen if we misuse alcohol. But that was really kind of where the story stopped. In my family of origin, we rarely spoke of this in any real way. But again, like I said, it was more of a cautionary tale in our home. And so when I was researching more about this concept of the ghosts in the nursery, I came upon author Arundhati Roy. And this author wrote in a book called The God of Small Things that careless words make people love you a little less. But in our house, it was the careful words, those cautionary tales, that did more of the damage. Because, you see, they weren't just stories, but they were boundaries made of fear. My grandmother was carrying so much weight of a daughter who she had physically lost. And I suspect that she felt that if she did not monitor every mood and control every friction, then another tragedy was inevitable. But by the time this energy reached my sister and myself, this container was already at a breaking point. And so how this showed up is when my sister and I fought, which adolescent girls do this, and we were only 3.5 years apart. It was never just kids being kids to her, to my grandmother. It was a threat to the stability that she was white knuckling to maintain. So what this would look like is my sister and I would have a fight, and my grandmother would get immediately overwhelmed. And I can remember her standing at the bottom of the stairs and with tears in her eyes and, constricted voice, like, you're going to regret this one day if something happens to either one of you. And then she would just disappear. And sometimes she'd get in the minivan and drive for hours. So that's why I've called this the minivan story. But other times she would shut herself in the bathroom and she would refuse to speak to us for days. And in those days of silence, what I remember was zero repair. So no parent, adult came out and said, I'm grieving and I'm overwhelmed. One day things would just be back to normal. But we as children were still standing in the shadow of that silence and very confused. And maybe even I can remember feeling a little angry that that this is how things went. And so in clinical terms, what we would call the way that I survived growing up was neuroception. And remember from previous episodes that neuroception is just simply your nervous system's internal radar that scans for danger below the level of conscious thought. So in my home as a child, I became this really astute emotional scientist. I was not just noticing the silence in my home when things like this would happen, but my body would do this thing where it would react to the vibration of the silence. And then when my grandmother would reemerge and everything was back to quote normal, what I would do then is I would be scanning for tone shifts. So knowing the difference between I'm just really tired versus I'm about to lock the door or I'm about to get in the minivan and I'm about to go away for the day. And the key takeaway here, again, is that my nervous system learned that other people's emotions, so in this case, my grandmother's, were my responsibility to manage because if I didn't manage it, then the other person, my grandmother, again, that I relied on most, she might break. Or worse, she might even just leave for good. And as a child who has a pretty significant abandonment history with my biological father, this was huge. So if you were being blamed, often though that crushing silence that screamed, your behavior is too much for this fragile system to hold. What happened was I grew up believing that I was the cause of this overwhelm. And because I was the cause of this overwhelm, that meant that I had to be the cure for it as well. So I want you to take a moment and just notice where you feel this in your body right now. So as you're listening to this story and you're thinking about your own nervous system and how it may have learned about other people's emotions and your responsibility to manage it, does your stomach tighten? Do your shoulders maybe move towards your ears? Are you clenching your jaw? And if so, then just know this without judging it, that this might very well be your survival wiring, this inner strategist part. Still trying to manage the grief of people who came before you. But I'm here to remind you that you are not responsible for the minivan driving away. You are not responsible for the door being closed without a plan of when it was going to open up. You are not responsible for the ghosts in your family's history. So I want to shift over into, again, how this might be showing up in your adult life. Now that we've looked at the ghosts in our history, we have to look at how they show up in present day, because the truth is we don't leave that minivan behind just because we grew up. We just swap the minivan for a text message or a dinner with the in-laws or a quiet evening on the couch with our spouse. And in adult life, false responsibility rarely looks like a crisis. That's why this can be so confusing sometimes, because it looks more like maybe a second shift of emotional labor that you're doing every single day. So think of it as after you deal with your own emotions, you're not off the clock yet. You've now got to clock in for somebody else's emotions. So examples of this are over apologizing for the things that are not even mistakes, saying I'm sorry just for taking up space, or having a different opinion. It's the over explaining where you give 10 reasons for a simple no because you're trying to preemptively soothe the other person's potential disappointment. But here's where it gets really exhausting. The mental replay. So if you've ever left a coffee date or a dinner date or just a meeting and spent the next 3 hours relitigating every sentence that you spoke, you are scanning for that one careless word that might make them love you a little less. You feel responsible for the silence in a conversation, as if it's a hole that you are legally required to fill. This is also sometimes looked at as the emotional forecaster expansion. So if there's tension in the room, you don't just notice it, but you own it. You just automatically own it as yours. Because again, you became an emotional forecaster, constantly calculating if your husband's too tired for you to mention a problem, or if your kid's meltdown is a direct reflection of your worth as a mother. You are living in a state of relational calculus, trying to solve for everyone else's peace so that you can finally have a moment of your own. And here is the clinical secret that I am here to share with you, that this isn't happening in your logical brain. This is happening in your body. And when I learned this, that this was a bottom-up situation that was happening, it brought a lot of relief for me and a lot of awakening for me as well. I was never I was never a math person at all. I'm still not. I will never be. And so when I think about relational calculus, I think about how hard I was trying to work to figure out this answer to this complicated problem. And now I know that it was not my problem to solve. But when you feel that urgent need to fix it, notice the physical neuroception again taking over. Notice the chest tightening. Notice the stomach clenching. Notice how your breath might even get a tad shallow. There is this frantic fix it now impulse that makes it impossible sometimes to just sit still while someone else is in discomfort. It doesn't feel like a thought, to me anyway, but it feels more like pressure in my body. That's the best way I know to describe it. It is, for me, a physical weight. It is my nervous system essentially telling me that I am in a functional freeze until that other person smiles again, responds again. And this is the survival wiring we talked about. So your body thinks that if you don't manage their mood, then the minivan is going to drive away again, or the door is going to lock. You are not being too much in these moments, but what's happening is that your system is just trying to secure its safety in the only way that it knows how. And so we have to be able to shift from false responsibility into a place of true responsibility. And this takes so much practice because we've probably spent our entire lives or our entire adult lives asking the question of why we carry so much, why we can't stop doing this. But I want to give you a tool today to help you start sorting through this weight. And this is the part where it's super helpful to anchor ourselves in real time. Because the truth is, you do have responsibilities. But for those of us with CPTSD, we've just been overfunctioning for so long that we've lost the ability to tell the difference between what belongs to us and what belongs to the world. So I want to pause here because many of you, especially the moms listening, have probably heard the well meaning parenting advice be the thermostat and not the thermometer. And I have to just have a guilty admission here that as a therapist who also supports parents in ways that they can help their children with emotional regulation, I have said this exact line to parents. I mean, it sounds so wise, right? Be the thermostat, not the thermometer. And really, what this means is don't just react to your child's temperature, but you get to be the one who sets the climate of the home. And to go a step further, I want to share that I was given this exact advice years ago when I was struggling to parent my oldest child. And I can remember going to this therapist, and I was in graduate school at the time, still learning about all of this neuroception and co-regulation. And my oldest, I think he was maybe about 7 or 8 years old, and he was having these huge emotional outbursts. And at the time, my CPTSD was not named yet. I did not know. I genuinely did not know that I was operating out of a survival brain. I didn't even know what a survival brain was. So when I heard that I should be the thermostat, all I heard is that I was failing. So if my child was melting down, I felt like I was the one who had to set the dial to chaos because I could not regulate the room. I felt like an utter failure as a mother. And then I double shamed myself because I was in graduate school learning all of this. I was trying to be a thermostat while my own internal system was in a 5-alarm fire. So, this false responsibility is really about believing that, again, you are the cause of the temperature. It's this belief that you must fix their internal state for you to be safe or good. And I wish I had known then that false responsibility includes other people's emotions, their reactions, their internal states. So, in terms of false responsibility, when it comes to other people's emotions, their anger or sadness is not your grade as a person. And when it comes to their reactions, you can't control their big feelings about a no. And as far as the internal states go, you are not their thermostat. You are their anchor. True responsibility, on the other hand, is the small, manageable plot of land that you actually own. It is your actions and words. So, did you stay as kind as you possibly could? Did you stay as present as you possibly could? Secondly, your actual impact. You are responsible for being a safe place to land, but you are not responsible for ensuring that they never feel the storm. So I want you to hear this reframe, and I want you to really let this settle into your body. And this is so much of the relief that I wish that I had had back then. Here it goes. You can care about someone without being responsible for regulating their internal world. Just feel the weight of that thermostat metaphor falling off your shoulders. Being an anchor means that you stay grounded while the storm happens around you. You are not trying to stop the wind. You are just making sure that you don't blow away with it. And this is the difference between drowning and standing on the shore with a life jacket. So, here is what shifting actually looks like. We've talked a lot about the why, but I want to talk about the how. So, how or what does it look like, rather, to put down this emotional shock absorber role in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon? It is not about a massive overnight transformation, but let's think of it more like micro shifts. So, interrupting the survival wiring just long enough to breathe. And an example of how I might use this is pausing before I apologize for something. I used to say, I'm sorry for everything. I would say sorry in emails. I would say sorry in texts. I would say sorry in person. And the next time you feel that I'm sorry bubbling up inside of you because a room goes quiet or a friend looks tired, I'm going to ask you to wait and count to 5. See what happens if you don't fill the silence. And for a lot of us recovering pleasers and fixers, 5 seconds is excruciating. But I promise it's not always going to feel that way if you practice it. Because what we're really working on is not rushing to fix the discomfort. So when your child is frustrated or your spouse is stressed out, see if you can try staying in the room if it feels safe enough without trying to change their mood. You are being an anchor and not a fixer. You are letting them have their own human reaction without making it your personal failure. And not only do I want you to practice pausing, I want you to also notice the urgency in your body. That fix it now pressure in your chest, that is your old survival wiring screaming that the minivan is leaving. You can notice that urgency, but not act on it. You can say to yourself, oh, gosh, I feel the pressure to fix this, but I am safe right now. And side note, when I first started really doing this work consistently, I had worked with my therapist on what we call a future template with EMDR, so eye movement and desensitization and reprocessing, which is just it's a therapeutic modality to help with trauma healing. But we would quite literally practice these scenarios where I would tell her about a common mishap in our home where I would just get so dysregulated right there alongside my son, and I would swoop in to try to fix it, kind of stay 10 steps ahead. And she would have me practice making contact with my body. And so for me, it's usually a hand on my heart and quite literally internally repeating, I feel the pressure to fix this, but I am safe right now. And it wasn't about stopping the pattern right away, but it was just enough to interrupt it and create some space. And every small pause, every second that I learned to wait before jumping in or over explaining or saying sorry for something that was not mine, that started to feel like such a huge win for me because I was literally retraining my nervous system to understand that other people's storms were not my emergency. But again, this took many, many months, dare I say, years. So just know that, I want you to keep the faith that this is going to be a process. So we have to be as compassionate with ourselves as we possibly can be. So as we wrap up the conversation today, I want to talk about the shadow that usually follows false responsibility, and that is shame. When we realize how much we've been overfunctioning, how much we've been managing others, it's easy to feel like something is wrong with us. I used to have these explosive parenting episodes with my oldest and think, why can't I just be a normal parent? Why is this so complicated? Why am I so needy in terms of outside support just to help my own child? I was in such shame about my inability to regulate myself. And I look back now, and again, I have such deep compassion for myself because how in the world was I supposed to know? I mean, the minivan was constantly driving away when my son would have these um, emotional outbursts. And that behavior, again, it's not a flaw, but it was adaptive and it's the way that I survived. I really learned to carry the weight of my grandmother's grief and my mother's mental illness and all of the cautionary tales of my family because that was the only way to secure love and safety in an unpredictable, extremely chaotic family system. So really, I can look at it now and go, dang, I was brilliant. I was a real strategist. So again, key takeaway here, if you learned to carry what wasn't yours, that was just an adaptation, right? So let that soften the edges of your self-judgment. You were doing exactly what you needed to survive, again, what is called the ghosts in the nursery. But here's the good news. The house is quiet now. You can learn to put the stones down. You are allowed to be responsible only for the person living inside of your own skin. I know that with this, we've covered a lot of ground from the legacy of the book, The Mad Wife, to the ghosts in our nurseries. But my ask is that if you could step back into your life, your spouse's stress, or your children's big emotions, I want to leave you with a recap today of just our three key takeaways. And the first one, again, if you'll remember that responsibility is a choice and it's not a feeling. So when that upset alert goes off in your chest, you can simply remind yourself, I can care about this person without being responsible for regulating their internal world. So just because I feel the weight does not mean that I have to pick that weight up. And secondly, survival is not a flaw. So if you catch yourself scanning the room for the emotional weather, please do not meet it with shame. Your hypervigilance was brilliant at the time when you were growing up to these ghosts in your history. You were being a strategist and you are allowed to outgrow this role. And finally, the pause is the progress. So you don't have to fix your entire nervous system today. In fact, you cannot fix your entire nervous system today. We're not looking at perfecting this. Just look for 1 5-second pause. One moment where you notice the fix it urgency and choose to stay anchored instead of strategizing. Because just because something feels like your responsibility does not mean that it is actually your responsibility. You are allowed to be okay, even when the room is hot. You are allowed to put the stones down. So if today's conversation felt heavy, or you're still wondering how to actually apply this when you're standing in your kitchen or sitting in your office, I want you to please consider joining me this Wednesday. I'll be dropping a special short midweek reframe, and we're going to be focusing on a strategy that we can use called One Thing That You Can Release Responsibility For Today. So we're moving away from the why in Wednesday's episode, and we're diving straight into the how. And I'm going to give you a simple real-time practice to help you identify this specific weight that you're carrying. So maybe, again, it's a spouse's mood or a friend's silence, and give you the nervous system tools to actually put that down. Because as I always say, We do not undo these patterns just by understanding them. We undo them by noticing them in real time. So thank you again for joining me today and trusting me with your story. And I look forward to seeing you on Wednesday for our midweek reframe practice. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for spending this time with me today. I hope you leave feeling a little lighter, a little more grounded, and a little closer to trusting yourself and your inner experience. If this episode resonated with you, please follow or subscribe so future conversations can meet you when they're needed. And if someone came to mind while you were listening, consider sharing this episode with them. That's one of the ways this work reaches the people who need it the most. You can find me on Instagram at Cindy Payne Rooted, and you can also visit me at cindypayne.com, where you'll find all episode links, blog posts, practice updates, and a free people-pleasing style quiz designed to help you notice your patterns with more compassion. And remember, every small step towards healing, self-trust, and presence matters. You are worthy of this journey. Thanks, everyone.